Hello, this is Matthias Goetz. This is my monthly update on the human condition. This is the 1st of September in year number 3 after Homo sapiens. Simple quote from Voltaire: "The common sense is not so common." Right. We'll have quite a lot of these newspaper article clippings, but I'll run through them quickly. Resilience, yeah, I said before, I don't like the word. I think it puts the emphasis and the onus on the wrong thing, certainly with regard to the COVID situation. I actually titled this talk Resilience ? Recession. The COVID crisis has brought the world into what may well be the deepest recession for many decades. Not the so-called COVID crisis alone. There are other factors such as the Ukraine crisis, Russia crisis, if you like, and also things happening within China, for example. Some are related to COVID, but some are not, which have repercussions on the rest of the world, etc. But certainly COVID is a big part of this, the sort of the aftermath of all the mistakes that were made over the last 2.5 years. They've driven us into a deep recession. Now, resilience, you may say, can never be wrong. Yeah, I mean, it's always good to be resilient in the time of crisis, but when the crisis is entirely man-made, as this one, as probably most crises, because external to us is nothing else than a harmless common cold virus. Everything else is man-made. Resilience alone isn't enough. I've always been arguing what we need is thinking. We need to do things differently. We need to avoid these mistakes. That's, I think, what I'm saying. Not just accept our mistakes and then be resilient in the wake of our mistakes. I mean, most of these mistakes we made were not necessary, certainly around COVID, because we knew most of the important things already 2.5 years ago when it started, just based on the data from China and some very early studies, like the one in the Rhineland I have talked about before in March 2022, which already basically showed you what to expect. So, and then logic, right? And applying logic to what is known about this type of viruses, which to some degree Sweden did, and virtually no other country did. So resilience is anodyne. Yeah, that's for losers. If you can do nothing else, at least you may be resilient, and there's nothing wrong with that. Again, and some of it is really needed. Personally, I need to be more resilient in the face of stupidity, and I find it very hard. But the key is to not be stupid, rather than to be resilient in the face of man-made stupidity. Yeah, so resilience is not my watchword at this time. Singapore won't get to herd immunity even with 100% COVID infection rate. Yeah, that's interesting because this is the Singaporean Minister of Health. I mean, it's sort of good that public figures publicly think about this, but it is not really helpful if they stick to notions about COVID that are, or SARS-CoV-2 that are wrong, right? Or to terms like herd immunity that they don't really define. I think Mr. Ong Ye Kung defines herd immunity as, oh, you will never get the virus again in your life. Yeah, if herd immunity means the virus basically does no longer circulate, or it circulates on such a low level that you're very unlikely to get it, right? That's his definition of herd immunity. But that is a definition that does not apply to this virus. And we've known that for basically for 2.5 years, or almost. This is a cold virus, so it will inevitably continue to infect all of us repeatedly, right through our entire life. And the point is, if it doesn't slip down into the lung, it is perfectly harmless, right? So herd immunity, in my language, when I talk about herd immunity, then in my language, it means you are 100% likely to get reinfected. But the likelihood that that reinfection leads to, or triggers a pneumonia in your lung is exceedingly low, because your immune system has learned to deal with the virus, whether it's been vaccinated or not. That distinction more and more just doesn't matter anymore, probably. In fact, you may be at a slight advantage if you were not vaccinated, as I've said before, right? Because you have a stronger natural immune response to the whole virus, whereas the vaccine is selective about what it does, and then but may slow down your infection sort of ratio, right, or the infection frequency, I should say, and thereby maybe somewhat prevent your immune system from getting to know the virus very well in all its facets. So those of us vaccinated may be at a slight disadvantage in the long run, but overall, whether or not you're vaccinated probably is not going to matter very much, nor where you're located. You know, so there are big differences in the early stage because of different policies, etc. But over time, all those differences, or most of those differences, get eradicated. Eventually, I would say, even in China, which still completely isolates itself from this natural progression, right? It will not be able to do that forever, in my prediction. So even China, that may take years, yes, 10 years maybe, or whatever, but eventually, even in China, there will be no more difference between people who have been vaccinated or not been vaccinated, right? Because they'll just have been repeatedly exposed to the natural thing anyways, and the immune system will have adapted anyways. And whether or not they will ever get pneumonia in conjunction with this virus is driven by their immune system, the quality of the immune system, and that's very closely correlated with age. So as they get older, you know, the likelihood goes up. But that's true everywhere in the world, right? But whether or not they've been vaccinated, re-vaccinated or boosted, it may have an effect in the short term, but not in the long term. Or not one. I mean, as I said, conceptually, it may have a slightly negative effect, but it would be very unlikely that the effect would be large enough to even really measure it. So, so Ong Kung says we will never have such a thing as herd immunity. He says that because he means we will never be shielded entirely from reinfection. Yeah, but that is a given and a no-brainer, and has been known for 2.5 years, Mr. Yekun. But the point here is we don't need to, right? We don't need that type of herd immunity. Our immune system has learned to deal with 200 of these viruses for millions of years, probably, and it has decided we don't need that type of hard herd immunity. What we need is, let's call it soft herd immunity. We need to just ensure the virus doesn't accidentally slip into our lung, and it rarely does. The cases of pneumonia, and pneumonia can also be kind of bacteria, not only viruses, right? But viruses are probably less than half of the triggers, more than half are bacteria, but nevertheless, the cases of pneumonia in the world per capita have been trending down for a long time. I mean, we're getting ever better at preventing, just because we are generally healthier, right? We are better fed, we have better nutrition, we have better defenses, our immune system is robust until usually we get really old. And so the instances in which a cold virus is able to penetrate into the lung, or not able to because it doesn't want to, but just by accident penetrates into the lung, have been on a decline, a gradual, steady decline over the last at least a century. And that, yes, there's a brief spike now because of this new virus, but that's just a brief spike, and then we will just be back to the previous trend. So the long-term trend is that our herd immunity against all forms of viruses that can trigger pneumonia, and that also includes influenza viruses, has tended to become better and better. And that's not because these viruses go away or because they are changing that much in terms of the how aggressive they are, if you like. No, but just because we are globally tending to get healthier and our immune systems stronger rather than weaker on average. Okay. Now that may not be a trend that will last forever, by the way, right? I mean, with what we are trying, with all these efforts that we make to keep our immune system away from training itself, I mean, there may be a point, an inflection point, where our immune system starts weakening, despite our wealth, because we just don't allow it to expose itself. And that may already be happening in some places, actually, but hard to know, right? But conceptually, that could happen. But no, my point is, and I've shown my usual graphic later on, I mean, by and large, the world has already reached herd immunity in the sense that most of us have been exposed at least once to the virus. Most of us, not only, I mean, most of us have been vaccinated, yes, but most of us have actually been exposed to the natural virus and dealt with it. And I've always said the first encounter is the most critical one, and after that it just gets easier, right? And many of us have already been exposed twice or thrice, and that just continues. And so we are already at a level where basically most countries' herd immunity has been reached in the sense that everybody has been either vaccinated or exposed, or both, or even multiple times exposed, right? As well as multiple times vaccinated. And so their defense against the virus slipping into the lung is extremely good. So in that sense, I would change this. Now, Singapore is, I don't want to talk about Singapore as a special case because they really haven't got that herd immunity yet, but that's Mr. Ong Ye Kung's and his colleagues' fault. That's the fault of their policy. But most countries, and Singapore is only 5.8 million people, so, and they're not in my model, but I mean, most people, most of the world have been exposed and have reached this level of herd immunity. But by my definition of herd immunity, his statement is wrong. Once Singapore does get 100% infection rate, which will take some time, given they are so cautious, but they will eventually, right? They will have long reached herd immunity, by my definition. By my, what I call soft herd immunity rather than hard herd immunity. But the point here is, if you don't really clarify what you mean with those terms, and Mr. Ong Ye Kung doesn't, these statements here, they may be wrong or they may just simply be meaningless. Right? Without a clear definition of what it means for herd immunity, the statement is, I can't even say it's wrong, because I first have to make an assumption as to what he means before I can say it's wrong or right. And this is, I think, typical for many statements that have been made about COVID. Right? There's a whole war going on, information war about who is being truthful and who is being untruthful about COVID. But in many of these cases, if you look closely, you can't decide it because it is not clear what they're talking about, because they haven't defined COVID, right? I mean, this is another minor point in brackets, right? There is no such thing as a COVID infection rate, right? D in COVID means disease, and the disease is not doesn't come as an infection rate. The virus, the underlying virus, SARS-CoV-2, may have an infection rate. That's what he means, right? He just freely mixes up COVID and SARS-CoV-2, COVID being a disease and SARS-CoV-2 being a virus. So this is a very educated man, but he does not, to this day, 2.5 years in, understand that there's a difference between a virus and a disease. Even a 3-year-old actually could understand that if you tell them, like, yeah, virus is a little thing here, and disease is a complex process of many, many things going on in our body, right? That this, to some degree, disables us, right? So even a 3-year-old could have said, oh, that's not the same thing. But Mr. Ong Ye Kung and many other politicians around the world, and many so-called experts even, do not recognize the, the distinction between COVID and SARS-CoV-2, and therefore they don't even realize that the statement COVID infection, that the term COVID infection rate is just simply non-existent. There's no such thing. But he means, I think, 100% SARS-CoV-2 infection rate. But even with that, then he needs to define what he means for herd immunity. And I'm saying, I think what he means for herd immunity is that you never catch the virus at all, right? And that idea, once you've understood that this is a cold virus, is so abstruse that the whole statement is meaningless. Yeah. There's no, you know, it is irrelevant, or it's I wouldn't even say it's misleading. I don't think he deliberately is trying to mislead anybody. He's just himself entirely misled about how this works and what this is and how to define the most basic things. And I mean, that is so typical of this entire debate for the last 2.5 years. I'm not picking on this particular individual. I'm just following Singapore a little bit because I've been based there. But, but it's not to say that this is only happening in Singapore. Not at all. Right? And I've shown many other examples. So this is just representative of global politicians and even, as I said, sadly, even so-called experts who do not define what they mean. Okay, nanotech tattoo. Now this is a bit of nice science fiction, but the point is, I mean, a tattoo is something that you can't get rid of, or well, very hard to get rid of, painful, and leaves behind scars. Right? It's not the trivial thing to get rid of. Now maybe it's not a tattoo in that sense, because they're talking about a device. So maybe it looks like an image, like a barcode maybe, or something like that, a QR code, but it's not actually tattooed on you. So maybe the word tattoo here is a bit of a misleading term, but you will be carrying basically a source of data about your health in your body that anybody who has access to it will be able to access, right? And you know, in theory, monitors that monitor your health could be located anywhere. And they, of course, say, oh, that's a good thing because, for example, your parents, if they're living alone and, you know, something happens to them, you know, this is much better than if they have like an alarm that they can push or something, right? This is the next evolution of that. Yeah, great. But I mean, I don't even have to start to explain what abuse this can open the door to. I mean, this, if you remember all these electronic devices used during the so-called COVID period in many countries, it's trackers, and you know, you had to lock in and lock out, otherwise you couldn't enter a building and all that. I mean, if you think that's the most abusive thing you've ever experienced in your life, you may be correct, but just wait for this. Always been saying we were treated like dogs, but maybe dogs actually won't get these tattoos. Only humans will be treated worse than dogs. And the thing about this is that people celebrate this. You know, I mean, this article that isn't very celebratory. It's quite, I mean, objective in a way, but it doesn't. There's no critical mind behind this. It was simply, it's reported. Oh, maybe we'll all be carrying the data source about our health with us that lots of people may then access, as if that is, you know, not something with a huge question mark all over it. Right? But that's, again, very typical of the era we are living in, that the idea that you have a body that you control and that you have a privacy sphere that you and nobody else controls is basically, with COVID now, completely gone. That idea is dead. Right? Now, some countries still have privacy laws or so, but they don't protect your privacy really, right? And they're obviously not meant to, because the general consensus seems to be that, why? No, you don't control your body. Other people will control your body. That is the direction in which this is taking us. It's maybe not too surprising that it comes out of one of those confusion, as I called it, confusion countries, with a very strongly collectivist culture. Maybe that's not surprising, but just wait. I mean, these tracking devices were installed even in many European countries, not only in Asian countries. Right? Yeah, and the same with this one, right? And they will just say, "Oh, we'll wait until it technically works, right? And then we'll have it, right?" But the idea that there is an ethical question here does not occur. Certainly not to this reporter, but I think it doesn't occur to most people. And the small minority that want to defend their personality or their personal integrity, they will again be stamped as conspiracy theorists or something like that. That's inevitable. Population, yeah, one of my pet topics. Chinese population should be shrinking by 2025. That's, yeah, as expected. In fact, maybe earlier. I think maybe next year. It's my gut feel. But by this, you don't go by gut feel with these things. You wait for the statistics to come out, and maybe they will show 2025. But it's imminent. It's in the next few years. Right? Now, I'm bringing this up here because, remember, in places like China, COVID policy may have a very significant accelerating effect on shrinking birth rates, in addition to also having an effect on immigration, right? Reducing immigration. Right? So, which is another component. Net immigration is another component of population growth. Right? So I'm just bringing that up here. I mean, it's not really new, but it is quite striking. And the expectation is that India will surpass China in terms of next year, which strikes me as very fast. Maybe put that a year later. But, again, there are people who have modeled this, and I will just go with them. Changing topic, yeah. Former Chancellor Schröder says Russia open to peace talks, but what's in under certain circumstances, sure. I mean, if they get everything, if they think they will get everything they want, then yeah, sure they would be. But let's see what he thinks they want. And Schröder says, in his view, is what will make Russia sit down and talk peace is A, Ukraine surrendering its claim to Crimea, and B, any aspirations to be a member of NATO. I think Ukraine will not do that, but de facto Crimea is Russian now, and that will not change. There is, as I said before, historical and also ethnic rationale for it. Actually, even if one disagrees with the way this annexation was conducted, but there is a rationale for Crimea belonging to Russia, more so than for it to belong to Ukraine. There's no rationale for a country sort of foregoing the right to choose their own defense alliances. Right? Ukraine can only come out of this as a wholly sovereign country that can make whatever defense arrangements it wants. Ukraine is not going to be the next Taiwan, which basically cannot fully independently act as a country. That, I think, is out of the question in my view. I mean, they might agree to not join NATO for the next 20 years or something like that, with a time bound. But anyways, it would not be imminent because so many preparations would be required. But I don't think that a country will forego, a sovereign country will, it's not even really feasible for a sovereign country to forego its right to join an alliance, because then it's no longer sovereign. Right? So I don't think Ukraine will give up its sovereignty. No. Surrendering Crimea is more realistic, but I don't think they will, not actively. I mean, they will not agree to it, but de facto, it's already the case, and that will remain the case. Now, interesting that Schroeder says the Donbass should remain part of Ukraine and the Russian minority should be given special rights. That is actually not totally out of the possibility. I mean, we've seen that in Georgia, for example. We've seen that in Moldavia. Those types of things. They are not very satisfactory because they tend to be unstable. They tend to create internal divergences within the country, but they don't have to be designed in such a way that they do, right? I mean, there are Western European countries in which certain minorities have certain special rights just so to protect them, right? That is not out of the question. Now, the thing is that in many of these parts, the Russian minority is a very significant minority. In some parts, it is the majority, actually, depending on how you define Russian. And they will not agree with that. They will not. They will say, no, we don't want to be part of Ukraine. Right? So this is something that maybe Ukraine could agree to. I'm not so sure that Russia would actually, so that Schroeder is right in his judgment that Russia would allow that, would go with that. But first of all, the local leaders who have been fighting for some type of autonomy or independence wouldn't give in. So, I mean, Schroeder always says he knows Putin better than anybody else. Maybe he does, but I mean, all of this doesn't sound like any of this is really feasible or logical, or it's going to happen. So I don't think there is anything here that increases the likelihood or opens an opportunity for peace talks. I don't see it. Great Barrier Reef, highest coral cover in 36 years. A key measure of reef health is more than 30% of the coral cover of high value, whatever that means. We don't need to investigate. And lo and behold, the Great Barrier Reef is healthier by that measure than it has been for a long time. And in two of the three parts of it, the health has improved significantly, and the third one, it has dropped slightly, but it's still above the 30% threshold. So all three parts now are considered healthy by this measure, and that hasn't been the case for some time. So yeah, it was much worse, just 5-7 years ago. So, and it's the best they've seen since they started monitoring 35 years ago, 37 years ago, right? So the reason I bring this up is because there's all this hype around climate change and save the planet and all the amazing damage we do to our nature. And I mean, there's no doubt that we're doing an amazing amount of damage to our nature in many, many different ways. There's no doubt, right? I'm not doubting that. But what I've been always saying is nature, we should trust in nature much more than we do. Nature is extremely powerful, right? It's just there. Nature's just there, and nature finds a way to deal. Life finds a way to come through on this planet. I mean, for 4-point-something billion years, it has, and with all the ups and downs, it's never gone away. Life is such as on this planet. Once it arrived, I mean, we don't know about the very early stage, but let's say beyond the very early stage, life never went away. Life itself always survived in new forms, right? It recovers, it reconfigures, it evolves, right? And I think this, to me, was just sort of a nice, rare example where an article actually says, yeah, nature isn't so helpless in this onslaught. Yeah. Yes, global temperature, ocean temperatures are rising. That can be measured. Yeah, and yes, that may not be good for certain coral, right? I get that, right? But evidently, that part of the coral reef, the corals that is considered high value, is prospering at this moment. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's directly linked to temperature rise. I mean, it may have other reasons. Right? I don't know that. It could be, but I don't know that. But it just goes to show that it's not like just a downward spiral. That, I mean, we're not anything like destroying this planet or its nature. We're transforming it, yes, with our actions. That is certainly the case. We're transforming it, but transformation is not per se negative or positive. It's neutral. It just means it becomes different under the evolutionary pressure, and our actions and our behaviors as humans put certain evolutionary pressure on ecosystems, and many, if not most, or even almost all of the ecosystems by now on this world. Yes, we are transforming probably the majority of the ecosystems on this planet very fast, but it doesn't mean that these ecosystems are all doomed. Some of them will be unrecognizable after the transformation. Yes, they will be very different. Yes. So if you're a conservative who thinks the only thing that really is worth having is the current status quo, then you must be devastated by this. But if you are in brackets, a progressive who says, "Oh, change is per se not bad, and new things will spring of it," you might see an opportunity here. Right? Yes, certain ecosystems will not survive, or they will only survive beyond recognition, but it doesn't need to be bad. Maybe the new thing that comes is, in some ways, is stronger, right? With Nietzsche, right? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That is also true for ecosystems, right? They constantly strengthen themselves against any kind of onslaught of changes in the climate or the ecosystem parameters, right? So I don't know, and the article doesn't really tell us why this is happening here, why the quality of the coral cover in the Great Barrier Reef, the biggest reef on Earth, has improved so much, so dramatically in a relatively short amount of time. The article doesn't really have answers to that. But first of all, the empirical fact is it's improving. And I hope that there will be some researchers who will pick this up and say, well, why? Could it be linked to climate change? Could the climate change be good for these coral, right? For some of them, right? So that's the kind of sophistication I would like to see in our conversations. As long as we're just, oh, it's all bad, it's all terrible, it's all destructive, and we're destroying our planet, that doesn't take us anywhere, that kind of hysteria. One, it's not true. There's no way as humans will destroy this planet. I mean, we will have to literally explode it to destroy it. We're not about to do that. And, it's not even clear that what this transformation that is happening, with the global climate, for example, that it is negative. I've said this before, right? It depends on who you ask. Right? For many, many life forms, it may be positive, maybe for these coral here. And the empirical or the modeled evidence from eons previously, hundreds of millions of years ago, when Earth's temperatures were much, much higher than they are now, and actually higher than what even the worst sort of predictions predict for this global warming, worse in apostrophes. There's evidence that those warm periods were also the periods of the highest biomass on Earth, not the lowest, and also the highest biodiversity. So both biomass, pure quantity of life, of living cells, if you like, living mass, and variety of life forms. Both of them were highest during the hot periods, not during the relatively cool periods that we're living in right now. So the global warming for many, many organisms may be a good thing, right? And it may spawn, whole new life forms if it lasts longer. Right? Now, it may be difficult for humans to adapt to it, possible. I mean, we are obviously the creation of a relatively cool period. So our brain and our behaviors, our humanity came about in a relatively cool period. So people may be worried in a very hot period, how will we fare? Maybe we won't fare as well. Possible, but we are not the measure of all things. I mean, unless you're very religious and you believe we are the God's chosen life form and everything else doesn't really matter. But then you shouldn't be one of those green folks who want to save the planet. Right? If you're just wanting to save our humanity the way you know it today, then yeah, you're just a conservative, basically. And, as you know, I don't share the point of view that this humanity as we have it right now is particularly worth saving. I mean, some of it probably is, but in fact, I would love to see it changing quite significantly. So Yeah, so a little reminder in this article for me that this is not a one-way street, or not. It's not a purely like downhill kind of journey. Right? It's much more complicated than that, and I would love to see more articles starting to talk about it, and then I would love to see more research going into the details as to, well, what do we think is driving this recovery of these reefs and these coral. Well, that would be, and maybe someone is doing that. So yeah, hopefully I'll find that. Wildlife more at risk than realized. Okay, that's more on the negative side again, which is much more frequent. The big study assessed the status of 147,000 plant and animals. Now, mind you, there are many millions of these, right? So 147,000 may look like a big number, but it's a small fraction of total life forms on Earth. So there are many millions of life forms on Earth, so of plants and animals, just taking plants and animals. So this is just a subset, and of course, but it's a big one. It's in some cases they found there's a lack of data, which said is itself a red flag, meaning there are lots of under-assessed species where we just simply don't know enough to even assess the risk. But so I mean, this is all good, but and many of them may be threatened. They use the word threatened and risk, but again, what is the definition of being at risk or being threatened? I think they are talking about certain species being threatened by extinction, and I believe that. And I think they're using certain criteria, such as if the population drops below a certain size or density, then there's a real statistical risk that the propagation will come to an end and the species will die out. I understand that, and I think that is true. But again, we need to have a discussion. So what? So what's the problem with the species going extinct? We don't seem to have any problem with all of these species having come into existence in the first place. So we seem to be biased in favor of, creation and against extinction, but we don't seem to recognize that in order for new species on this planet to arise, other species may have to give way. There's a limited number, and it's a big number, but there's a limit to how many species we can have on this planet. And even if there wasn't a limit, so why is it necessarily good to have 10 million species, but it would be very bad to have 9 million species? These numbers are purely arbitrary, right? So people here may be correct in saying there's a risk that statistically certain species may die out because the population has so thinned out that they no longer effectively reproduce because mates don't meet each other. Children don't survive because parents can't find food anymore. They can't hunt because they hunt in a pack and there's no more pack. Whatever I'm sure there are many. I'm probably being simplistic here, but. Many good reasons why a species could die out, right? And basically it dies out when the reproductive success is below a certain threshold, right? And the reproductive success is below a certain threshold because the environment, the conditions within the ecosystem have just deteriorated from their point of view to a point where they no longer can uphold themselves and reproduce. So all understood, and yes, that will happen, but so what, right? That would be the discussion. I mean, the research is fine. It gives us data, but there's no discussion here about the data. So what does it mean? Why would we worry, or do we worry, or is there something we should or should not do about this? I mean, I'm all in favor of cataloging all these species, including the under-assessed one. That's great to know. I mean, I'm all in favor of having the knowledge, including to know when a species is extinguished, right? It may sound sad, but first of all, it's just an empirical fact. But sometimes we don't know for sure that it's extinguished, and sometimes 20 years later we find individuals of that species and find it wasn't extinct, right? That happens too, but that's relatively rare, right? That if all indications over a certain period of time show that apparently there are no more individuals of these species left, then we can consider them extinct. But that is, first of all, an empirical finding. And it's not something to get too emotional about. Right? And there needs to be a recognition that species come and go, including us. They come and they go. That's nature. For species to be threatened is natural. An ecosystem, by definition, or a set of ecosystem, or a planet like ours, is a limited resource, and there's limited space for life, and space both in the four-dimensional sense, but also in terms of the possibilities of how life can evolve is to some degree limited by the basic physics and chemistry of this place, right? So there's limited space and scope for life to proliferate. It's huge, but it's still, there's a limit, right? And there's competition, therefore, for the scarce resources. And because there's competition, there will inevitably be some species that are winners and some species that, over time, become losers. And there will be inevitably some species that are extinguished. I mean, we've had huge extinguishing events on this planet, sometimes triggered by external factors, etc. All of that is natural. It is natural for species to be threatened, right? And I think that's what I'm not seeing in the debate here. Although they're not saying, I mean, they're using the term like red flag. They don't say it's bad, but they imply it between the lines. This is terrible. Right? Just the terms risk and threat are already very negative. They're not incorrect. They're not wrong, right? And they can be used, but there has to be a recognition, I think, that all of us are at risk all the time. That's the nature of life, is to be at risk. At any moment, you are at risk. Otherwise, you wouldn't really be living. You would be a dead stone, then maybe you're not at risk. And all species, in some way or another, are always threatened, or at least at risk of being threatened, because there's competition constantly. All of this is how it is. I'm not even saying how it should be, but how it is. This is what nature is all about. So the people who are talking about saving nature, but then thinking that these risks and these threats are something negative, they haven't understood nature. So they haven't understood the thing that they claim they want to save. And then you go, it's great, you want to save something, but you haven't even understood what it is that you're trying to save. And by the way, you can't save nature. Nature can only save itself, and there's no saving involved. Nature just is. And it is still going to be there, no matter how much climate change we produce as humans. No matter what we do, nature does not go away. The whole universe is nature, and there may be many universes. All of that is nature. It doesn't go away just because some little tiny humans on the little tiny planet Earth, are changing the temperature of the atmosphere. So don't go there. Don't think in terms of I need to save nature, or even in terms of I need to save planet Earth. Planet Earth is quite good at taking care of itself. So by all means, let's have this data, that's great, but then let's also have a debate about it and a conversation about it that is somewhat more intelligent and not hysterical. COVID stigma in China, this is a really sad thing. I mean, I've predicted that 2.5 years ago when Xi Jinping traveled to Wuhan in March 2020 and raised his hand, remember, and said, COVID stop in our country. I basically said this was going to happen. Right? This is a cold virus, perfectly harmless in its own right. But it's created societies, especially in China, but not limited to China. It has created societies where having been infected with the virus carries a stigma. And worst of all, the state almost forces you to uncover that infection, even if you have no symptoms, by mass testing and almost force testing you, as they do in China repeatedly, continuously in many places, forces you to uncover that stigma. So the state forces you to reveal that stigma that it then sort of triggers. So that's a double whammy, right? Not only are you stigmatized if you've been infected with this harmless virus, but you're forced to reveal your own stigma. And then there's COVID discrimination. Yeah, I said that 2.5 years ago that was going to happen. And not only in China, okay? I wasn't even focused on China at the time. I was talking much more about the Western countries. But clearly in the so-called Confucian societies, this danger of stigma and discrimination is much bigger, right? Because they're much more collectivist, right? And they immediately put the onus on you to protect everybody else rather than protect yourself. I mean, more individualistically oriented societies, an individual's first priority is to defend themselves and protect themselves, and not just protect from the virus. That's not what I mean, but protect from impositions by others, policies, by to protect themselves from stigmas, protect themselves from discrimination. In more individualistically oriented countries, everybody's more or less called on to do that for themselves. Right? In a collectivist society, you are called upon to do it for others. And if you fail, you have failed the entire society. That's a terrible, terrible type of peer pressure being put on people. Now, in so-called Confucian societies, people have been living like that for hundreds of years, thousands of years, maybe in some cases. So nothing new in some ways. This is just an extension of what was there before, right? It's just a symptomatic of an underlying social system, if you like, right? But when you read it, when I read it, I find it very sad, nevertheless, because I think of each of those Chinese people as an individual. Their government doesn't, but I do. So it hurts for every single one of them who is affected by this. It hurts, I think. Macau returns to, yeah, this happens all the time in all the Chinese cities, not just in Macau or Hong Kong, but all the mainland cities as well. And it's just a cases there in neighboring city, and then you're basically either shut down or forced into mass testing. They sealed up the infected person's apartment. Imagine that. He is a person who has just a cold virus, one of 200. But if it's discovered, you are sealed up in your apartment and treated like worse than a pariah. As if this was the plague. It isn't the plague. But you're treated as if this was the plague. The plague being a very fatal infection, right? Very dangerous one. This one being a harmless one, in brackets, except if you are so old that it's your time to die a natural death, and here's the opportunity to die a natural death. Right? That's very different with a plague, where indiscriminately young, medium-aged, and old people are indiscriminately affected. That's a very different proposition. Right? It's understandable if authorities take measures against the plague. It's not understandable if authorities take this type of measures against cold virus. It's a very different thing. But that's back to, again, the lack of definition, right? What it is that you do. And again, in the headline, one of those many instances, mass COVID-19 testing. There's no COVID-19 test, right? There's a SARS-CoV-2 test, remember? Yeah, but it just goes on and on and on and on. And there is no effort after 2.5 years to at least get the vocabulary right. And if you have the vocabulary wrong, it is no wonder that your mind is messy about this whole thing. You can't think clearly if you cannot even define the basic concepts that you're talking about. Yeah. Commenting, missile used to kill Al-Qaeda leader, part of a scary new generation. Now, there are two things here. One, the US, occasionally also other countries, but certainly the US, continues to use, assassinations as means of politics, right? Which is just completely unethical, and it undermines everything that the US claims that they stand for, right? They just deliberately assassinate people that they deem to be political or military opponents. But I think the bigger point here is that a whole new generation of unregulated weapons. This is quite this ninja missile that they used to kill this person. That's quite an extraordinary thing. It doesn't kill by explosive. I hadn't realized until I read this article. It is armed with blades. It literally physically has to hit the target like a bullet, and it kills. And because its precision, isn't 100%, just before it reaches the target, apparently sideways in all four directions, huge blades sort of, open up out of the rocket. Like I guess that's a mechanism of flipping them open, and they are sharp, right? And so the sharpness of the blades and the pure, like the impact of the fast traveling missile will very likely kill any person that is hit by any of these blades, right? So by having those blades, a rocket whose radius may just be 20 centimeters or less, 10 centimeters, depending on what type of rocket it is, if it can unfold half-meter long blades, it's got a radius of more than half a meter all of a sudden, or a diameter of a meter or more, like this, right? And it will therefore, even if it is not 100% precise, very likely then hit the target as long as it's within a meter. Hits, it comes down within a meter of that person, right? And it did in this case. So that's fascinating for weapons buffs. And of course, the idea is, it limits collateral damage because there's no explosion. So if there are people around that person, hopefully, unless they're very close to him, hopefully they will not have been hit, right? That's very kind, right? It's very surgical assassination at a distance, but it has all the negative things about, first of all, assassination at a distance using fire and forget kind of technology where the killer isn't even in the picture, right? I mean, it lowers the threshold for killings, right? At least in the good olden days, if you were the killer, you were there on the spot when you killed the other person. You were there. You saw the blood sputtering, and you knew it was you who had done this, right? And even the worst criminal has some kind of a conscience, right? I mean, okay, except for politicians, maybe. No, we all have a conscience, right? Yes, some consciences are probably very blunted, and sometimes a person just convinces themselves that against a better conscience, they will kill someone for some reason, right? That happens, yes. That's called then murder, right? But there's still a conscience. Yeah, but if you just fire a rocket at the distance and then, that's it, and wait to hear from some report whether or not it hit a target, it lowers the threshold for someone to just do it and walk away. It's the same phenomenon of the people who weren't directly involved in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, but who were part of the supply chains, and they were so remote from it. We don't really know what's going on in this country. We don't think of them as concentration camps. We're just doing our duty, and we're just supplying some material here, right? So this detachment that allows potentially millions of people to partake in an atrocity, in a genocide, or at least an ethnic cleansing exercise of the highest order, and not even feel particularly guilty about it, yeah, because it's so remote from them, right? And all these weapons at a distance, they all carry that problem. I think it's a real problem. I mean, in the olden days, when people killed each other, it was hand-to-hand combat. And it was their own sweat and tears and blood that sometimes they had to give in order to kill that other person. There was a self-sacrifice involved in it, right? Even if they prevailed and the other person did not. There was a kind of a duel, an eye-to-eye duel, not always exactly among equals, not always fair. I mean, they would use all means available. And of course, they already had bows and arrows, which is weapon at a distance, or spare, right? So it's not like perfect, but there was much more closeness and involvedness on both sides, both the killer and the one who was being killed. And there's there was, the killer took not only a risk of being seen or even being injured himself, but there was also his conscience could not escape from what he was doing. Right? He had to confront wholeheartedly what he was doing. If you just push a button and somewhere else, some person then almost by magic dies, right? And then you go home and have dinner with the family, right? Yeah. It lowers the threshold for murder. This is murder. This kind of an assassination. It's cold-blooded murder. And so there's a murderer here, but he will never be called a murderer because he just did his duty. He just pushed a button. Yeah, I find that very, it's natural development in terms of technology. Technology cannot be stopped, and these things will inevitably come about. So I'm not surprised, and maybe it's not even worth thinking too much about it because it is inevitable anyways. But yeah, I think it is, when I read this, I feel like, a little bit sad, right? This is what humanity also is. We are first-rate experts in creating one-sided weapons and competitive advantages, and creating a sterile atmosphere in which killing a man is no different than killing an ant, because it's so sterile, right? And that other person that you're killing is actually so far from you that you don't think of them as another man, like you, a father maybe of children, a husband to a wife. No. It's just a statistic at some point. Yeah, that's where we're going. SARS-related coronavirus infect around 66,000 people a year in Southeast Asia, and they're talking about bat-to-human transfer and spillover and so on. It's common in the region. Now, I thought this was really highly fascinating, and I couldn't believe that this kind of an article doesn't create more sort of debate. They're basically saying, they just studied Southeast Asia, but I'm sure this is not unique to Southeast Asia. A multitude, and they're not giving numbers here, but a multitude of SARS-related coronavirus. And remember, we already had 4 of them incumbent to us, endemic to us, before SARS-CoV-2. Right? And, they're all part of the common cold virus, family, if you like. And apparently what this article says, what the study says, is we are constantly exposed to new types of these viruses, and sometimes we get infected by them. Now, in the majority of the cases, the virus may not be good at transmitting itself from one infected person to another, and then it just doesn't make headway among humanity. They may still be successful, within that bat species or other animal species in which they had been hosting them up to that point, right? So they're not going away as a species. But every time they try to jump over to humans and they manage to infect a human, meaning they manage to infect human cells and replicate within them, which is a big step, it doesn't mean yet, though, that from one human that they've successfully infected, they're able to transmit to another human, right? Which is where the transmission chain comes in and the multiplication comes in. So I suspect that in many of these cases, the virus just never gets past the first human or a small group of humans. I remember so-called SARS-1, 20 years ago. It did infect probably hundreds of thousands of people, but it stalled. It was too slow, and it just lost momentum and then went away, right? Even though it had probably infected hundreds of, or at least tens of thousands, because there were about 1,000 deaths, and the fatality rate would not have been that high. So even if it was significantly higher than for SARS-CoV-2. So there must have been tens, if not hundreds of thousands of infected people. They were just not discovered because there was no way to discover them, because most of them may not have had any significant symptoms, or symptoms that they could clearly differentiate, right? Only when people died, then autopsy might have been done, and then it might have been found that it was this particular SARS-1 virus. So that virus was somewhat successful in humans, but still it didn't make it, right? So the threshold for coronavirus to become endemic in humans may be quite high, actually, which is one element of what I read into this study here. So it happens all the time that we're exposed to them, but rarely do they become problematic for us, because usually somewhere is the end of the line for them. They infect one human or a small group of humans, and then they don't make it beyond. Right? Why? Because our immune systems are so effective in keeping them down, and because their transmission mechanisms aren't good enough. Right? It's competitive. Right? It's competitive. Remember, we already colonized by 200 common cold viruses that regularly colonize our upper respiratory system. So this real estate is very, very busy and very, very much competed for, right? So for a new virus, a new coronavirus, for example, and I'm sure there are also non-coronaviruses that also come our way, right? Retroviruses, etc. But okay, just focusing on coronaviruses here. They try to jump over all the time, naturally. I mean, just because human populations are so big, and even the bat populations are quite big in some places, that close contact between humans and bats, and of course the same applies for other mammals, is inevitable, right, at some point or another. And so this is not surprising, right? And whenever there's close contact, viruses will be spilled over. They're not doing this actively, remember? They're not consciously spilling over. They're just, being spilled over through the air, through liquid, or whatever transports them. They can be transported in many different ways. And whenever humans get close to animals, there is this exchange. And it's a two-way exchange, by the way. We are also transporting our viruses to them, remember? We're just less hung up on that. we are also a danger to the animals, right? Not just them to us. But, largely, what the study said, largely it's not a danger, because our immune systems just work. It just shows you how actively they engage with viruses all the time, and new viruses all the time. Right? Which is fascinating. And then, in the vast majority of cases, the virus doesn't really make it because our immune system is too strong. And then, if you then go back to SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-2 has clearly made it. Right? It's become endemic to us. I have no doubt. It's not going to go away. I mean, it would be very surprising if it did. As have those other 200 common cold viruses that we currently have, right? They have made it, right? But they're just a tiny tip of the iceberg, probably much tinier tip than the proverbial tip of the iceberg, which is what, 1/5 or 1/6 of the total mass of the iceberg. This is probably much less than the proverbial tip of the iceberg. Only a very small fraction of those attempts of colonizing us are successful. Right. I think that's what I read from this study. I think that's very fascinating, and it would be so lovely to see that being discussed, But this kind of article doesn't seem to get a lot of attention, even though it explains very nicely to some degree what is actually happening, what is actually the case, right? A SARS-CoV-2 type virus jumping over to us is the most common thing. That it does stick and is successful, that is uncommon. And we might say thankfully, right? And why is that so uncommon? Well, one answer clearly is because we have these powerful immune systems, right? There may be some other reasons related to the virus. They show that SARS-1 was inherently less fit than SARS-2, right? So it's not just our immune system, it's also on their side that there's, that there are factors that decide whether or not the spilling over is successful. But certainly one of the elements, from our point of view, the key element is just simply our immune systems. Right? And that these kinds of findings do not trigger an interest in our immune system, that the whole 2.5 years of COVID have not triggered any significant discussion of the centrality of our immune systems, is truly surprising and mind-boggling. We are so hung up on viruses, we are so fascinated by them. But there's something much more complex when virus is involved, which is our immune system. And we don't bother to even talk about it. We pay no attention to it. Thankfully, it is so powerful, it doesn't need our attention. It will just continue doing its job anyways, thankfully. But it is surprising that we're not talking about the things that actually really matter in this, which is our immune system first and foremost, and not the virus. Virus is always, in a way, accidental. As you can see here, it could be any virus, be any kind of coronavirus or some other virus. And it happens all the time. It's trivial in that sense. Right? The one part that is not trivial in this is that our immune system is so enormously able to fend them off almost all the time. And if it's not able to fend them off and they become successful in us, the immune system is nevertheless successful in limiting their impact. In other words, in creating an immune herd immunity in which very rarely do these viruses enter a vital organ such as the lung, in which they can do real damage. That is amazing. But either I'm the only person who sees this, or everybody has already seen it and says, yeah, Matthias, that's so obvious, we don't need to talk about it. But I don't get that feeling. That is so obvious. So either I'm ahead of everybody else or I'm behind of everybody else. I don't know. First white paper on Taiwan since Xi Jinping came into power, refusing to rule out force. I am just bringing this up because you may say, well, there's nothing new here, really, right? Hasn't that been the case? Yeah, it has been. But I think Xi Jinping is a different kind of animal than previous Chinese presidents. And I think he's now bidding for a third term. He will presumably get it. He may then go for fourth term, who knows, right? So he may be around for a while. But my prediction was before he seizes power or dies in office, he will have wanted to seize Taiwan. So Taiwan will become part of China within the lifetime of Xi Jinping. That is my prediction. It's just a prediction. Of course, I may turn out to be wrong, but like any prediction, but that's my prediction. He will not want to either leave office or die before he has completed this job. US CDC no longer recommends students quarantine for COVID-19 exposure. This is one of those things. I mean, I respect the CDC in the US. It's provided better data than almost any other organization I've tapped into. But that they ever recommended students to quarantine is a disgrace. And that it took them 2.5 years to stop this disgrace is an even bigger disgrace. And the argument, because 95% of the population has either been vaccinated or been exposed, or both, or both, which is in line with my figures. Yes, my figures now show 99% for the US. They say 95%, and as of mid-August, I say actually it's already 99% now for the US as of this month, and according to my figures. My figures may be slightly optimistic, and again, I don't really challenge their data here. It's probably somewhere between 95 and 99%, perhaps, if you can settle on that, but it's very high. But I challenge this argument that they say, oh, you no longer need to quarantine because of this penetration. There was never a reason for students or anybody to quarantine, never. This is a fake argument. It's not fake data, but fake argument. Most Singaporeans feel more united than before the pandemic. Other countries see that differently. Yeah, no, Singapore is unique in that you don't know what people really feel because you don't know whether people actually really feel anything because they are so brainwashed throughout their entire life by the education system and the media and the government, basically, the whole ideology of the state. So it's not necessarily meaningful for them to give their opinion, because do they have an opinion? I mean, are Singaporeans even, by and large, even capable of having an opinion? Well, you might say every human can have an opinion, yeah. But I mean, but what is it worth if they've never learned to in the least to think for themselves. Right? So I didn't pick this statistic because it highlights Singapore. I picked the statistic, I'm not interested in what the Singaporeans say, but I am interested in some of the other countries. So Sweden, for example, there does seem, feeling more united isn't the same thing as being, agreeing with a certain policy, by the way, so we have to be careful. But by and large, it seems that the Swedes have really close ranks behind their government, and the government, remember, at least in the early stage, was by far the most rational of all the governments in terms of their response to COVID. And so what maybe this, and I'm saying maybe because I don't know exactly what it means to feel more united, I don't even know exactly what the question was, what they say their country is now more divided or more united. Okay, so we know what the question was, but what people think when they hear the word divided and united may differ hugely. I don't actually know exactly what I would think. If I was asked this question, I'm not sure I would be able to answer it. What does it mean, divided or united? And of course, there's yet another question: is it good or bad to be divided or united? That is that's the next meta level of discussion, right? See, in Singapore, there's an ideology behind this. Why they even publish this, right? The ideology behind it is that they didn't make up this data, but they choose what they publish, and they have a good reason usually for publishing something. And the ideology in Singapore is that united is good. We need to be a united. A division is bad, right? So there's an ideology behind it. And then, oh, look, we are more united. Oh, wonderful. We did the right thing. Right? That's basically what it comes down to when they publish this data, right? It's a self-celebratory thing by the rulers to say, oh, we further united the country. And that's a good thing because for 50 years, we've been hammering into your brain that we have to be united, right? Because we're this small, puny, little defenseless country that so many bad neighbors. And so we have to be united. That has been, Singapore ideology 101 for 57 years. I'm not here to argue with that. I'm just saying that's an outlier. Most countries do not have that type of an ideology, right? Most countries shown here don't. Right? So what it means to be united or divided may mean different things for different people, right? But interesting, on the one extreme of the Western countries, you have Sweden saying, well, we actually feel united by the pandemic. And I think it probably suggests that they're sort of embracing, that the majority embraced the policies of the government more than in other countries. And again, the government was the most rational of all the governments. So the Swedes have embraced that rational response. That's how I read this data. I may read it wrongly. As I said, it's not straightforward to interpret this kind of vocabulary, even united and divided. What does it exactly mean? A country, can a country be united and divided? Right? Maybe people can be, but maybe not a whole nation. Right? Maybe 2 or 3 people or 10 people can be united or divided. Can a whole nation be divided or united? I'm not sure. I buy that. But okay, let's not get sidetracked too much. Take the other extreme. United States. Now, the United States has a tradition of a strong political, if you like, divide between blue and red, right? Democrat and Republican. And they look at their states in those colors. Well, this is a blue state and this is a red state. Some states are sort of in the middle, or they oscillate between the two, but some states are very red and some states are very blue. So a very strong tradition, and maybe majority of people who share a certain type of political outlook and who are united around that, but they are very divided then from the neighboring state that has maybe the opposite color. So what I want to say is the United States probably strikes me as a country where there's a systematic division politically, and it served the US well. in many respects, not in all respects maybe, but in many respects. It's been, it's wealthy, it's powerful, it's quite durable by now, more than 300 years, right? And counting. So by those kind of measures, it served the United States well. A strong division into two political camps that compete and oppose each other, and who's in a constant like tug of war, going back and going forth and back and forth, and that dynamic having created the successful society. So I'm not surprised that the majority of people say we are now even more divided than before, because there were, I think, quite significant differences between those two camps in terms of COVID policy. And if people say we are even more divided now than we normally are, right? It means it did matter to them, right? It mattered to them, and this debate was, in the US at least, was pursued with some vigor. Interestingly, Germany almost as high. I did not expect that, because in Germany there was a debate. There was a small minority that was really having a very different, a much more rational, I should add, a view than the government. They were small but vocal, and they did preoccupy the media quite a bit, right? Although, as I said, they were usually stamped as conspiracy theorists and so on, hooligans sometimes and so on. But the reality is people did engage with them on the media quite a bit, because they were there, they were noisy, and they had a voice, even though it wasn't a very big group. So maybe, I'm a little bit surprised at this, but not entirely surprised, because I think a lot of, but maybe the Germans, how they look at dividedness is different than maybe the Americans. So the Americans, to be divided is this is a normal thing. That's how the country functions. Germany, to some degree, that's true, but the political camps are not as clear-cut. They're not like two clearly opposing forces, right? Rather, there are 4 or 5 parties that have some voter base and influence, and they spread across the spectrum, and so there's much more coalition forming, but that also means that there are more blurry lines between them, and the confrontations are not as bipolar as they are in the United States. So Germans normally aren't as divided. So for them to say we are much more divided now, or for a big majority in the survey to say we are more divided than before, that is quite significant, right? And many Germans will mean that in a negative way. They mean, oh, too bad we are now more divided. This is terrible that we are so divided, right? And I suspect that many of those people who say that would blame that minority, that vocal minority, who wanted a rational policy. So my interpretation of the German data here would be a majority of people rejects the rational minority and blames them for having divided the country. They may not articulate it in that way, and not all people think alike, but that would be my hypothesis as to how to interpret this data. Sorry, I want to stop here. Just pick the United States, Germany, and Sweden, and briefly Singapore, because that's where the article actually came from. Just to show, you squeeze people around the world into a certain framework and ask them a certain type of question. You may say the question is quite clear enough, isn't it? But what they mean by their answer can be hugely diverse. So to show it like this, like a nice clean statistic, is in itself misleading, right? Arguably here, the Singaporean government that allowed this to be published, anything that is published in Singapore media is basically passed through government censor. So they allowed this to be, or even wanted this to be published, is they're already, by publishing it without further commentary, critical commentary, already being disingenuous. They pretend that in all countries, divided and united means the same thing as in Singapore. In Singapore, for the average Singaporean reader, very clearly, united is good. You want to be more united, right? You want to be on the right here, not on the left, right? So if you're coming from that place as a reader in Singapore, immediately, and you assume that for the American or the German, it means the same thing, immediately what jumps into your eyes, oh, we did so well. We, Singapore, and by implication, our government did so well. This is a very clever piece of propaganda. But that sentiment that the average Singaporean reader will get when they read this has nothing to do, with the actual feelings of people in those other countries. Those other countries are just being held up as if they were like Singapore. And hey, we are just better than them. It was very objective metric, it's very objective, right? Divided or united, you ask the same number of people in different countries, and it's very objective, isn't it, right? And look, and we are doing so. We are just out competing on this criterion, everybody else, right? Whoa! Actually, not at all, not at all. Most of these other countries had much more, not just rational, but ethnically defensible policies than did Singapore. In fact, probably almost all of them did. A. B, in some of these countries, being divided is the normal state of affairs that keeps these countries being successful and keep them going, right? Unlike in Singapore, where it's being suppressed, right? So the whole ideological system is completely different, right? Thirdly, what an individual interviewee thinks when they hear the word united or divided is very different, and it obviously differs from one individual to the next. But if you bracket it by countries, your average German, your average American will think very differently about what this means than your average Singaporean, who, as I say, has been indoctrinated to think about it in a certain way. Right? This statistic may not have really been published in many Western newspapers at all, because the question of whether we are divided or united isn't even one that is very high on the agenda for anybody. It doesn't really, I don't think many people even care. Yes, you can ask them and they will give you an answer. It looks so as if it is so comparable across countries, but the importance of this question presumably varies hugely by country. A lot of these countries listed here, we couldn't care less. This is purely something that the Singaporean government cares about. And by indoctrination, the Singaporean citizen, right? So this is a very clever, this happens every day in Singapore, so this is not anything unusual, right? It just jumped out and I picked it up, but it happens every day in the media in Singapore. You could analyze it as much as you want, you will always get to the same place. Everything is placed very carefully. Everything is manipulative. Everything is designed to support a certain government-driven ideology. See, they didn't ask, they would never publish something, do you agree with this and that particular policy? Well, they sometimes do, but only after carefully evaluating whether it will harm the government or not, right? They're very crafty and careful about what they publish and what they do not publish. Right? Anyway, so now, we again go back away from Singapore and talk about, there are many European countries here and North American countries, Japan as well, and Malaysia. And this may be a selection that the Singaporeans took because Malaysia is a neighbor and they like to compare with them. But mostly it's Western countries. And the general tendency is that in most countries, people think the pandemic has divided the country more. And as a general tendency, they probably mean that the government policies were not supported by everyone. They were divisive, right? And even if they had a majority of the support, there will have been in many countries a vocal minority that strictly opposed it. As I said, in Germany, it was the case. And I'm sure it was the case in some of these other countries here. And so without judging whether, what was right or wrong, or what policy was effective or not effective, people are saying, clearly this was a topic in which, even if there was something of a majority view, it did not lend itself to creating a social consensus, right? Because there are two, and now it's my interpretation, there are two that almost opposed values involved. One is a sort of a strict value of every single life that can be extended must be extended. Call it an ideology, if you will, an ideology of the preservation of life. And the other side is one that the basic human rights in any country, and many of these countries have some basic human rights. When Germany has Article 1 of their basic law, talked about it before, the dignity of the individual is beyond, cannot be touched by anybody, by the state or anybody. The dignity of the individual is beyond, should be beyond reach, should be unbreakable, right? It's the Article 1 of the German basic law, right? So there's the opposing view, or the not opposing view. It's not that they're opposing each other, it's just like two different values that are very difficult to reconcile, at least at first glance, and at least in the short term. One being we must extend every life that we can possibly extend, versus we must protect the basic individual rights at all costs, even if it may be at the cost of some lives being shortened. Right? This is a bit like the abortion debates, right? Between the pro-life and pro-choice. That's usually how they're formulaically called, the two camps. But one says, no, the value of the inviolability of that new life is greater than any other consideration. The other one says, the right of the individual woman to make choices about her own body exceeds the other considerations, right? And these two are diametrical to each other in that they cannot easily be reconciled. Right? They're divisive in that sense, and both of them are values. Both of them are like values that can be rationally explained. Now, you and I may put different weights on those values, but we cannot easily dismiss either of them, right, as a value. And that's where the divisiveness comes in, right? If you have a society in which you have strong advocates who can have a voice for both views or both values, then you will have a dividedness. So to some degree, the degree of dividedness here is a measure of the diversity of values in the society. Singapore, of course, wants to have no diversity of values. They want to have a single set of values defined by the party and followed by everybody else. The US, and obviously Netherlands, Germany, and some others, on the other hand, have a very clear division of values, where significant groups of people do not agree on what are the most important values. And they realize that some values sometimes are not reconcilable or not easily reconcilable. And so they struggle with that. And that's where the dividedness comes in, because one group will say, no, this value is the most important and has to be upheld no matter what. And the other group says, no, this other value that is not fully reconcilable with the first one is the one that matters most and needs to be upheld. And then you have a dividedness. And it's almost inevitable in a society that is somewhat pluralistic in their value systems. So to some degree, and again, we want to be cautious about making too big statements about these simple surveys, this is what you see here as a measure of the degree of multiplicity of values prevalent in the given society, or the degree of pluralism So by that measure, the United States, the Netherlands, and Germany are the three most pluralistic societies in this sample. Yeah, they're not, to some degree, they're probably also among the most individualistic. That's probably somewhat correlated, but pluralistic here just means you have distinct value systems that are to some degree rational and being debated and being held by significant groups of people. They don't have to be the majority, but they have a voice. People who actually have a voice in that society through the media and other means. In Singapore, if your voice doesn't match the one of the government, then you don't have a voice. So there's really no scope in Singapore for dividedness. Everything the government does is trying to undermine any opening within which this kind of pluralism and therefore dividedness could even occur. I think Sweden in this case is different. The government, for all I know, doesn't make any effort to create this kind of monoculture of ideology. In Sweden's case here, the data seems to be similar to that in Singapore, but the background of it is very different, in that the government simply did make some fairly rational choices, and the majority of the population simply recognized that. So Sweden has a relatively low score on the dividedness for very different reason than Singapore, and it's totally not comparable in any way, right? As the data here, or the way it's presented, may suggest there is a certain basic comparability, but there isn't. Anyways, I'm going very far out of the window here, interpreting a very limited data set with a very basic question. So I don't want to go further than that, but I just thought this was fascinating, so I brought it to you. Now this is interesting, right? The previous Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, remember him? He was a hawk on the whole COVID thing. He basically evidently has not read the basic laws of his country, which I'm sure exist. This, basic protection of individual rights. He clearly hasn't read them. It's his COVID policy, but yeah, he was one of those people I labeled a Nazi, I think, at some point. Yeah, and I don't backtrack on that. I had no idea of this, but it transpires that his successor unveiled that the prime minister actually undermined, in his words, undermined democracy by unofficially and without notifying anybody outside a very small inner circle, taking control of key functions, key portfolios in the government. The health and finance portfolio, so he did direct control of the whole COVID thing, right? Home affairs. So the whole thing about lockdowns and policies, health ministry, the finance portfolio, which is needed to fund certain things, and then the home affairs. Those were the most important portfolios, presumably doing that, for his aggressive zero COVID policy, right? He was basically like Xi Jinping in China for quite some time. And it turns out he was only able to impose that rigid policy by basically taking steps that may have been unlawful under Australian law, and at least in terms of his successor's point of view, they undermined democracy. Now, this saga has just started. We will see what the investigation shows, and there will be an investigation, I think. And of course, prime ministers are hardly ever been taken responsible for their actions. So presumably Scott Morrison will not be made responsible for his actions either. So I don't expect too much to come of this, but it is a little indication, I think, just how anti-democratic those zero COVID policies were, whether in China or in Australia or New Zealand, for example. And that it was really almost impossible to pursue those types of policies without unprecedented political power that you had to seize some way or another. And in this case, Mr. Morrison apparently seized it in ways that weren't kosher, not acceptable, and maybe even illegal. His colleague in New Zealand, that other Nazi, she apparently, I mean, we don't know yet, right? But what she did, but maybe she did something similar too. But she apparently somehow harnessed a lot of popular support for her approach. So she may not have needed this kind of trick to push her zero COVID policy through. But let's hold our breath, because maybe something transpires in New Zealand eventually that isn't so kosher either, right? I mean, when I call these people Nazis, I'm not suggesting they're the same type exactly as those German Nazis, 80 years ago. I'm not really suggesting that, right? I'm using the Nazi label as a label, as an analogy to some degree. But the analogy being, these people disregard any basic individual rights to push through a policy that is very ideologically driven. Let's leave it at that. That's what I mean when I call them Nazis. Doesn't mean they don't have popular support. The Nazis did too for a pretty long time, until everything unraveled. So it's not about having popular support or not, right? Which I know is one of the foundations of democracy, but it's not the only one. There's a written codex, a law. And there's a constitution which founds that democracy. And zero COVID policy is not in any way, in my view, compatible with any of the constitutions of any of the Western countries. Yeah, and I mean, what this little thing, for me, it's just a little thing, but it doesn't surprise. It's like, oh yeah, I'm not surprised at all. It's this Scott Morrison guy. I mean, he's exactly the type of guy who would do this kind of thing, right? You could sort of tell, right? And am I surprised? No. But it does go to show that, a Nazi is someone to whom any means is appropriate, as long as it helps him in fulfilling his ideology, right? And so it was for Scott Morrison. Didn't care whether seizing this unprecedented power and resources was democratic or legal. It didn't matter. That's the hallmark of a Nazi, in my definition. Because the ideology supersedes all else. All other considerations become secondary or negligible. And that's exactly what happened in Australia. Putin lashes out at US over Ukraine and Taiwan. Now, this is interesting because you can see how a new Russo-Chinese or Sino-Russian alliance is being forged. And it's an uneasy alliance. It will always be an uneasy alliance for a number of reasons. But what Putin is pointing out is that he considers Ukraine, as well as brackets Belarus, as well as some provinces like Transnistria or some provinces in Georgia, Ossetia, for example. He considers these territories to relate to Russia in a way that is similar, not exactly identical, but similar to the way China sees Taiwan, Tibet, to some degree. Tibet, they really consider it's just China. They don't even think of it as Tibet. Hong Kong, Macau, and the South China Sea Islands. The way those territories they considered relate to China. They are basically part of China. And I think what Putin is indirectly signaling is that the Ukraine, or these parts of the Ukraine, are essentially part of Russia, in his view, as is Belarus. And yes, they can be given certain autonomy. They may be run as if they were a separate country, but not a fully sovereign one. Just like China so far has accepted Taiwan being run autonomously without ever accepting that it is a separate country, right? So I think Putin is putting himself into a very similar position as successive Chinese presidents have done with China, right, vis-a-vis Taiwan and a few other territories. That is really, I think, quite interesting, because he can then speak the same language, and he can then lean on China, who have always upheld that self-declared principle of national integrity, that, you know, the integrity of a nation state like China, and in brackets Taiwan being by their definition clearly part of that, being inviolable, Putin can then lean on the Chinese influence and power and propaganda to say the same thing with respect to Ukraine, or at least parts of Ukraine. This is an unholy alliance that is forming here. It's sort of an unwritten alliance, but it's a sort of an alliance nevertheless. The Chinese don't proactively embrace it, but they also don't reject it. Even the Chinese need allies. And the one thing that Russia still has, and China not yet, is a fully fledged global nuclear capability. So China still benefits from an alliance with Russia, in addition to, of course, commercially, all the raw materials the Russia supplies, etc. Very important to China. So there's a new bloc emerging that is not so much based on communist ideology, because Putin is not a communist, really. Not a proper communist, anyways. He's not a proper Democrat either. He's a dictator of the good old school, or if you like, a Tsar, a monarch almost. And he, was, you know, still, you know, clearly a Communist Party in power in China. So they're not ideologically very close nowadays, certainly, and they've never really been that close. Even their versions of communism are quite different. But they share this perspective on the nation state and the nation state's right to defend those borders that they themselves have defined to be their borders, without seeking necessarily diplomatic support for that definition. Yeah, to some degree they do seek diplomatic support, but they're secondary. The primary thing is we define our borders, and then we have every right to defend them. That they share, that sort of viewpoint they share. And on that basis, they share something very important that can be operationalized into a proper alliance if they wanted to. So I think, I'm saying this, you know, I think there's a geopolitical shift going on where China, for the first time, is seeking, or at least is not rejecting, a sort of alliance with another major power. Up to now, they've basically gone it alone. And they've created sort of vassal states around them through the Road and Belt Initiative, etc., dependencies, let's call them, of lesser states. But with Russia, at least in terms of defense, it's their equal. Not economically, but in terms of defense, it's their equal. In terms of its ability to project power, Russia is even ahead of China still, right? So, so the first time here there is, at least the first time in a long time, there's an approachment between two great powers that is clearly directed, to some degree directed against the Western alliance. That is very noteworthy. It changes the dynamic. It adds to China the one thing it doesn't yet have on its own, which is a global nuclear capability. COVID-19 harmful effect on the brain reverberate years later. This study was very confusing. In many ways, confused about the definition of COVID-19, about the definition of so-called long COVID, and I'm very confused by this. Oxford research just showed in March that even a mild case, and in brackets they mean a mild case of someone having been infected with SARS-CoV-2 and having shown mild symptoms, right? That's, I think, what they mean. They call it COVID, but in my definition, that is not COVID, that is just a cold, right? But be that as it may, a mild case they mean someone who was infected with SARS-CoV-2 and had certain mild symptoms, meaning common cold type of symptoms or flu type of symptoms, was associated with brain shrinkage equivalent to as much as a decade of normal aging. I find that totally unbelievable. That cannot possibly be correct. Now, the study analyzed 14 cases, 14 diagnoses. So, I mean, the first observation is that is, of course, a very, very small sample. That I'm not even blaming them for that because, I mean, this detailed kind of study, you can't do too many samples, right? It's hugely costly, I'm sure. But yeah, let's first of all just say it's a very small sample. So to draw such a generalized conclusion from such a small sample, that is certainly iffy. Then they have another sample, 1.28 million people with a confirmed COVID-19 diagnostic or diagnosis. Okay, now here I really want to know, do they really mean these people were diagnosed with pneumonia? Or do they simply mean these people had tested positive for SARS-CoV-2? Again, I don't know what they mean by the definition. It's very hard. It's hard to imagine that they really surveyed 1.28 million people with an active pneumonia during this period, because no, there wouldn't have been such a big number. I mean, in Britain, you have, let's say, nearly 200,000 deaths, and the ratio is 1 to 5. So roughly, right, of people who get hospitalized with pneumonia, and the percentage who die is about 1 in 4 to 1 in 5. So if you had just under 200,000 fatalities, the total number of people who were hospitalized with COVID-19 will have been under 1 million. So they can't, if they say 1.28 million, they can't mean those hospitalized people who actually had symptoms of pneumonia. They must be meaning people who just simply had tested positive. And, you know, which is, so they had probably symptoms. So they were probably symptomatic because they say they were matched with an equal number of people who had other respiratory infections as a control. So who also had a cold, but who didn't test positive, right? And they say that those who that among those whose common cold, basically, cold symptoms were caused by SARS-CoV-2, there was a significantly higher incidence of long-term brain impact than among those who had another type of cold. I really find that very, very hard to believe. Now, I mean, it does suggest that this, again, they talk about brain fog. I don't know what that is. Epilepsy, seizures. I mean, I've totally conceptually, right, speaking as a philosopher, conceptually, if a new virus infects you that your body has not encountered before, all kind of things will happen in your immune system. And surely the brain is a part of your immune system. I mean, some of the immune functions are controlled by the brain. I have no doubt of that. The immune system has multiple components. It's complex, and one of these elements, or many of these elements, are related to the brain. So that a first-time infection with a respiratory virus, cold virus, a new virus that you had not encountered before, triggers a reaction in your brain that I take as a given. And that reaction will be different from all the others that you've encountered before. And because they may have once triggered a reaction in your brain when you first encountered them, or the first few times you encountered them, but since then you've encountered them so many times that there's no more reaction. So if you take a control group that had a normal infection, normal cold, with viruses that they have known for a long time, since their early childhood, you would not expect any brain reaction, right? Because it's already so well known, nothing that needs to be adjusted, or very little. Whereas with a new virus, you would definitely expect to find changes, physical changes in the brain, because any reaction of the brain, and when it adapts to something new, incur physical changes, right? I mean, any thought you have, any dream you have, any book you read incurs physical changes in your brain, right? Because new connections are being made, etc., right? So you totally would expect changes to your brain, and you would hope them to be lasting, right? Because you want that blueprint to be deposited in your brain, if you like, or in your, maybe in all your cells. I don't know exactly the mechanism, but certainly the brain has a function, as I say. So you would expect, and you would want permanent changes to your brain, because it means your immune system has reacted, has learned, and that learning, to some degree at least, is permanent. Right? That blueprint that the brain has started to create of this new virus is being stored permanently. Right? So you would expect changes to your brain. But these changes would be nothing like an epilepsy or seizures or brain health disorders. So I really wonder, I mean, not that I would expect that, right? But I'm curious, right? I really wonder whether these researchers separate changes to the brain that are necessary when you encounter a new virus, and that are, if you like, welcome, right? You want them to take place, and changes that may be a negative side effect of this new virus having penetrated you, and your brain and your immune system having started to react to it, and there's side effects that are negative, that are health issues, if you like, or could potentially be harmful. How they're segregating them, how they are defining them, and in how far they then found, and it seems like they found that some of those side effects of your brain's new interaction with a new virus are lasting, and they can be negative. Conceptually, that makes sense to me. Now, that they think that even a mild encounter, so an encounter with a virus that has mild, comes with mild symptoms, that it shrinks the brain to the tunes of a decade of normal aging. I don't know by how much the brain shrinks with 10 years of aging, to be honest. Maybe it's a tiny fraction, I don't know. But that they say this one encounter with a new virus triggers that kind of shrinkage. I cannot see any reason for that. Right? It is totally surprising. And I don't believe it until I have much, much better data on that. I mean, if that's based on the 14 diagnosis, I just don't buy it. Right? It would have to be very clear what that shrinkage involves, what on the level of chemistry really happens, and what in terms of numbers of neurons and so on in the brain that are affected, and what's the mechanism, what's this purported or supposed mechanism that creates this. We just saw earlier that in Southeast Asia, every year, 66,000 people encounter a new coronavirus, a novel coronavirus. So, this is, so now that's not a big number out of 600 million people in Southeast Asia, but still, I mean, this is obviously something that happens to us all the time. So it would really be, and of course with this virus now, it happens to all of us, all 8 billion of us. will encounter this virus, this new virus, the first time, right? Because it is so successful. So all, I mean, if I read this correctly, then all of us, 8 billion people, either already have or will have very shortly our brains shrunk to the tunes equivalent of 10 years of aging. I find that very, very, that's what they are essentially saying here, because since all of us will have some mild form of encountering the virus, if this is a general statement, it means that all 8 billion of us will have a brain shrinkage this year or next equivalent to 10 years of aging. I really do not see that. I think it just doesn't seem plausible to me. At least I cannot see the mechanism or the reason why nature would have it so. Right? So there would have to be at least much more explanation around this finding. I mean, it's very interesting, but this is just the beginning. I think this really needs to be explored before I believe any of it. And I hope, of course, that it will be explored. So here, in Singapore, you had a few cases of people who defied the mask mandate. They become quite sort of blown up in the media because, of course, the government has an interest in highlighting these cases. And they were, I talked about before how it touched me that these people were considered potentially mentally ill, and before they were put into prison, were put into a mental asylum for further study. I mean, this is sheer Nazi kind of policy, right? This which really touched me very strongly at that time. Now, this person here, this is a later case, meaning I think happened in 2022, when the government had started to be a bit more rational about their COVID policies. He's fined, and he's being publicly put to show on the Pranger, we call it in German, so everybody can see and spit at him. But he's apparently not been put into a mental asylum nor into prison, as far as I can see. For not wearing the face mask properly. I never wore my face mask properly in Singapore. Properly being, I never wore it over the nose because I can't breathe with the thing on, and I find it dehumanizing and degrading. I was never caught. Luckily, I could have been this man. Fined $8,000 for not wearing. Basically, he's being fined $8,000 for being a sovereign individual. And the other two prominent cases earlier, who were then also put in a mental asylum, were the same. They were basically acting as sovereign individuals. And in Singapore, that's what you're being punished for. Because under Singaporean ideology, there cannot be such a thing as a sovereign individual. That's what this punishment is about. It's not really about whether they covered them also. Yeah. You're only welcome in Singapore if you behave like cattle. Facebook bans a US anti-vaccine group. Yeah. So this is, I mean, I don't know this group, this anti-vaccine group. I don't know what they're saying, what they're claiming. I don't know the truth value of what they say, or what I certainly know that much of what the governments have said was untrue, or at least misleading or misguided. But I don't know what these types of groups in the US are saying, and I don't really care. But I do care to see that a private enterprise like Facebook is now playing the role of censor against free speech. Misinformation that could lead to real world harm. Now, 99% of or more of all the things all governments in the world have said about COVID falls into the category of misinformation that not only could, but did lead to real world harm. So to ban a group on that grounds the first thing Facebook would have to do is to ban all governments from its site, but it doesn't do that. So this is clearly not honest or authentic, right? Because clearly those groups, namely governments, that were most implicated in this type of misinformation, that did real harm, almost everything the governments did real harm, they're not actually being covered by this ban, by the censorship. So you now have a situation where multinationals conduct censorship on behalf of a government that itself needs censoring. This is a very, very unhealthy development for democracy. It just makes the US so much less democratic and liberal and open and just. This is unjust to pick on one group that is a private group, but not on the main perpetrators who happen to be governments, perpetrators of misinformation about COVID. 3 in 5 Filipino students still unvaccinated after 2 years of school shutdown. This is a tragedy, right? The Philippines had one of the worst records in terms of school closures. As I've always said, no single school closure was ever called for, necessary, or required, or even positive, or even impactful. It was negatively impactful. Right? There's no positive impact from these closures. And the fact if 3 of 5 students are still unvaccinated means that 2 in 5 students have been vaccinated. Students don't need any vaccinations, unless maybe they have an autoimmune disease or something, a known reason, which is very rare. So all of this is just so wrong and so hurtful to just read this. Twice as many people died with COVID in the UK in the summer than in the summer comparable period a year earlier. Yeah. Yeah, they say it's associated with the current variant, but I think it's predominantly associated with the fact that this year Britons behaved normally. This summer they traveled, whereas the year prior they did not behave normally. They either were locked up or self-locked up, self-disciplined themselves. Right? So yes, thank God that twice as many people died this summer. This is a natural fatality now. Last year it was unnatural. COVID vaccine 32% effective in kids under 5. Yeah, this is also very sad. Now this data may be correct, right? I'm not arguing with the statement that it's effective, although I would of course immediately ask what you mean by effective, remember? They never say what they mean by that. But the word effectiveness implies that it is useful for kids, but it isn't. It's counterproductive for kids, as I've said many times. And the vaccine makers who are now desperate because all the revenues are going away, because fewer and fewer vaccinations take place, thank God, desperately clinging now to the idea that all those who haven't yet been vaccinated, which includes especially the younger people, must now be vaccinated at all costs. Why? Because it's their revenue stream. Now, there's no other reason for it, right, other than the revenue streams. But so they publish this kind of data. Oh, it's effective. They don't even say what they mean by effective. I think it means that for a certain period of time, the child does not get infected with the virus. I think that's what they mean. But it's irrelevant because in almost no instance do children develop a pneumonia from it, right? So this data is correct, but totally irrelevant. But they use this irrelevant data to make a case for governments advocating and advertising their product for children. Where it is very clear that to children it's not only unnecessary, but it is really counterproductive in terms of the healthy development of their immune systems. This is criminal, or borderline criminal, what is now happening. Google finds inoculating people against misinformation. So this is another part. So Facebook is just sort of banning a certain vocal group. Google is actively what they call inoculating people against misinformation by preempting them what they consider to be misinformation by feeding people with what they consider to be the truth. Right? So you have, this is even worse than what Facebook is doing, right? Because you have Google now, the arbiter of the truth. Google decides, and they say they want to enable healthy civic conversation, but it's Google who decides what's healthy. So Google here really enters the realm of ideology and politics, right? I mean, they always probably do, but very clearly, they feed their users, and there's billions of people, they now proactively feed them what they consider, or their ideology prescribes to them as the truth. They don't just ban one group or another. That is still a very limited and surgical intervention that Facebook is doing. They are mass producing now a certain type of information that they, who is they? Some people up in the top management of this company, presumably, believe, and this is now faith, right, and religion. This is an ideology. This is no longer anything to do with facts, right? What they believe to be the right faith, religion, with respect to COVID and other such things, they actively feed that to their huge user base to influence them. That is really amazing. US set to ship record crude. So this is just ironic, right? Because Russia, of course, this is one of those unintended side effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They're strengthening the US, especially the US's energy and oil, especially the oil sector. The US says, thank you. The US is a big producer and a big net exporter of crude. And so the prices having gone through the roof thanks to the Russians is very welcome. And the whole, remember the shale discussion, shale gas and shale oil, that an environmentally rather questionable approach to generating oil and gas that really comes into its own when the oil price hits something around 80, 90, 100, which is the case now thanks to Russia. And all of those shale gas and shale and oil producers are now probably celebrating Putin. He's resurrected an entire branch of the US economy, which is very powerful and an important branch of the, and so he's fueling US economic growth with his war. Certainly also the arms manufacturers, but also the oil and gas manufacturers. So thank you, Mr. Putin. You are our good friend. So funny. Israel, I'm always a big fan of Israeli propaganda, as you know. The nuclear deal that's sort of being resurrected now with Iran, right? Or maybe being sort of resurrected, would give Iran $100 billion to destabilize the region. That is so funny. Now, obviously, the by far most important factor of destabilization in the Near East in the last 75 years has been the state of Israel. Right? I mean, it is a bigger factor than all other factors taken together in destabilizing that region. So the hypocrisy of this kind of a statement is very typical for the Israeli government. Almost everything they say is hypocritical, right? But this is just mind-boggling, right? It will enable Iran to destabilize the region. Now, this is from the organization, the State of Israel, that is the destabilizer of that region. This is so funny. Future work, changes to hardware. As I love this word, there's a new term here, endemicity. So a year ago, the Singapore government declared that the virus was now endemic in Singapore. Of course, it was always endemic in Singapore. but they declared it to be endemic last August. So it's just about 1 year ago. And now Singaporeans apparently invented the term endemicity. So they've dropped the word new normal, and maybe they've dropped the word near normal that I talked about on another occasion. But now they have the word endemicity. Of course, the same applies for all the other cold viruses and influenza viruses and all kinds of other viruses. But this virus that just has to be so special that it gets its own terminology. So they're settling into endemicity, meaning we're living with this virus, but uneasily and watchfully and carefully and scaredly. We are still very much scared of it. And in that context, they investigate how people's habits have changed and how durable that will be. And so it's interesting, right? And they immediately then turn to pragmatics, which is one of the strengths of Singapore, right? It has a very clear ideology, but it immediately then turns it into pragmatics, right? So they say, okay, we now and the government always takes the lead. So we now define this as an endemic situation, and so we now then go pragmatically about redesigning the workplace to accommodate that definition. Whereas other countries in the West, they've just moved on. For them, the virus is just another virus, right? They've now really, by and large, not entirely, we'll see in the winter, but by and large moved on, and they no longer really allow the virus or the so-called pandemic to drive their design of their daily lives. Singapore is different, right? They've recategorized the virus from dangerous to being endemic, sort of from we have to fight it to the teeth to we have to live with it uneasily. But they still use the virus as, if you like, an excuse or a trigger or a motivator to make changes to the workplace. Some of those changes may be very clever, and very future-oriented, no doubt. So some of those changes may be positive changes. I don't argue with that. Right? What I'm interested in is that they use the virus or the pandemic as an excuse or a reason or rationale for making certain changes. That, by and large, doesn't really happen in the West. Right? Yes, they were trying to fight the virus, and they kind of accepted the virus, and now they've just sort of forgotten about the virus. Singapore has not forgotten about the virus. They instrumentalized the virus for new design, for example, in the workplace. And these are profound changes. And they are usually designed to position Singapore at the forefront of modern work, the future of work, of attracting top talent in the future, etc. All of these things are tied to this. But they're using the virus as an excuse, right? Oh, yeah, Singaporeans will now have to accept a different type of a hybrid type of work, some of it at home, some of it at work, and different new ways of working, a lot of it on Zoom, or whatever the changes are. Actually, they're pragmatic and they're geared towards the future, making Singapore continue to be competitive in the way it has been competitive, but using the virus as a trigger and an excuse. That's typical Singapore. Stuff that new car owners should have in the car. I just picked this up from some Singaporean site, and I thought it was so funny and so also so typical. 9 items that the new car owner should have in his car. Mind you, most Singaporeans have never been a car owner because of very restrictive regulations around car ownership. It's extremely expensive, artificially made extremely expensive. So, but there are, of course, there are always some new car owners. I mean, this kind of debate wouldn't happen in a Western country where everybody has grown up with cars all around them, right? But in Singapore, there's still a lot of people who, for the first time, maybe acquire a car, and it's a big thing. And so here's some suggestions as to what you should have in your car. And what is so interesting is the 5 highlighted ones are safety or personal comfort, Number one, disinfectant wipes. Number two, nitrile gloves. Number four, tissues. Okay, those can be used for many purposes. Number five, cleaning cloths. So it's all about hygiene, safety, umbrellas, just don't get wet, right? I mean, fair enough, right? Why not have an umbrella in your car? I mean, in a tropical country where there's a lot of rain, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just so. And the other ones are also kind of hygiene factors, charging cable, power bank, and the cash card. The cash card is needed in Singapore because they have charging gantries where you drive through and you have to have the cash card in your car. And if there's no money on it, you will be fined. So you better make sure you have a backup cash card that has some money on it. Yeah, all of this is all hygiene. Basically, all of the things that Singaporeans, in a little way, are scared of. They're scared of losing connectivity with their mobile phone, and they're scared of being fined because of this, and so on and so forth. The only one that actually has anything to do with the car is the puncture repair kit, and that I looked up because I didn't know what it was. And it's basically you plug some kind of a plastic into the hole, if you can identify the hole, and presumably that allows you to continue driving. But I just never heard of that before. I mean, if you have a puncture, you better change your tire. Interesting. Here, interestingly, a couple of this is in Singapore, but articles about China, so that are somewhat questioning the Chinese zero COVID policy. That's interesting for Singapore to do. And they're focusing it on collateral damage. So they're not openly criticizing China's policy. They would never do that. But by pointing out, for example, that it hits the mental health of youth. Yeah, of course it does. And of course it's completely, entirely nonsensical to do that. And by the way, Singapore has done the same for the last 2.5 years. It's just sort of slowly coming out of that now. But it is an indirect way of saying here's why we are not copying the Chinese zero COVID policy any longer. It indirectly explains to conservative Singaporeans why the Singaporean government is not following that route anymore. More lockdowns. And I mean, what's interesting here is that the journalist talks about the 20th National Congress, which is the one where Xi Jinping will be re-elected for an unprecedented third term. If he is being re-elected, I assume he will be, but we'll see. Which suggests that, of course, until that Congress has taken place in the next 3 months. So let's say for most of the rest of this year, China will not, Xi Jinping will not change its policy, because this zero COVID policy has been a hallmark of this bid for this unprecedented third term. So he will not change that policy. The interesting question is, once he's been re-elected, does he then feel safe enough to maybe change the policy? Because it does clearly hurt China in many ways, economically especially. So that will be interesting to watch. Maybe once he has been re-elected, maybe early next year, maybe there will be a change to zero COVID. South Korea triples baby payments. Now, this is back to what I said about the schizophrenia about population management. Global population is still bulging, growing significantly every day, but some countries that already have shrinking populations, like South Korea, are going all out of their way to encourage more babies. This is maybe logical on their local level, but it's certainly completely illogical from the point of view of humankind. We already have way too many humans on this planet, I think. No, there's no rational limit, of course. So that's just an opinion of mine. We are already overpopulated, in my opinion. And all Korea needs to do is open borders to immigration. you know, so to level off that population more equally across different places. But they don't do that. Instead, they financially subsidize the production of new babies, which is not what the planet Earth really needs at this moment. But they are not alone. Of course, I spoke about several European countries doing the same. This is just quite unprecedented, triple the payments, $1,000 a month per baby. I mean, that's real money. Right? So it's completely contrary to all the lip service paid to, oh, we have to fight climate change and serve planet Earth. It's completely contrary to it. Yes, Singapore, they have a Protection of Online Falsehood and Manipulation Act, so censorship online sites. Issued a warning to a group called the Truth Warriors, who published articles by top biologists. Now, those biologists may not own the truth for sure, but so does government all the time, right? And they said that most vaccinated countries have most COVID cases. So that's an interesting correlation, I guess, but it's clearly a spurious one, right? So, I mean, I understand if that article did not clearly state that it's a spurious correlation, then the government or private individuals who read it might be protesting against it because, yes, there may be that correlation, but it's clearly a spurious correlation. And that clearly would have to be set in such an article. So I haven't read the article, I have no opinion, but both sides of the divide use arguments that are wrong, right, or misleading. Right? Correlation can be spurious, and certainly correlation does not equal causation, as everybody knows, but not everybody actually does know. Right? Some readers may be misled by this kind of correlation. At least the article, as I said, would have to clearly state that this correlation is spurious because conceptually it makes no sense. Clearly, vaccination does slow down the number of cases, but not the opposite. Right? That's very clear. Right? That doesn't mean a country cannot at the same time have a high vaccination rate and a high case number. Totally they can. But that correlation is a spurious correlation. The one thing is not directly related to the other. Rather, there are some underlying factors such as the general openness of the country, for example, that may support both a high vaccination rate and a high circulation of the virus. But if the article didn't clearly state that this correlation must be spurious and then maybe explore what the underlying factors might be, then it is indeed a misleading article, right? And it is somewhat understandable if people are up in arms against it. What is not understandable is that it's the government doing that, because the government, of course, again, in Singapore more than anywhere else, is the main provider of misinformation. So this is purely one-sided. It would have to be at least some kind of open public debate about the merits of these kind of contents, right? Instead of a government agency just clamping down on it. That is what the government is doing here is even more counterproductive than what those types of truth warriors may potentially have done when if they misled. That leads me to my reverse Turing test that I've invented. At what point is a human so brainwashed that he should no longer be considered a human? We could apply a reverse Turing test, I propose. if the subject is treated like a thing, let's say like an artificial intelligence, but still realizes that it is being treated like a thing, then it is still human. So a Singaporean that realizes that they're being treated like a thing, like a piece of cattle, if you want, or an artificial intelligence that is more intelligent than cattle, but that is not human intelligence, then they're still human. If the subject is treated like an AI or like a thing, but no longer realizes it, then it has itself become a thing or an artificial intelligence, and it is no longer human. That is my proposed reverse Turing test. So you can be manipulated, but you're only human if you at least realize that you're being manipulated. And the moment where you no longer realize that the thoughts you're having are not your own, not entirely your own, they're not voluntary thoughts, they're imposed by others, in that moment you are no longer human. That's my proposal. Last night, yeah, so that's my moment of breathing. I've just taken the decision to run through the rest really quick. One thing I should highlight, I found a little bug in my model. I had to debug, and the penetration rate went down a little bit as a result. I also find that I may have to push up my IFR to 0.24, and I may do that next month. So I'm just sort of announcing that now. I haven't done it this month, but there are too many countries now that are hitting the 99% or the 100% or going above the 100% for comfort. So I think I need to increase my IFR at least one more time. And I will probably do that next month. The changes to my model, the corrections, this was really not changes, but really just corrections. I made a mistake in copying over and having some locked cells that should have been unlocked and so on. So just technical errors that I made in my modeling led to the COVID fatality number to go down quite a bit compared to last months, whereas the excess mortality rate, which is not driven off my model, it's taken from external sources, that continues to gradually go up. Continuing mapping progressions, we've seen that the summer in Europe generated quite a lot of fatalities. And you saw the articles about the UK earlier saying twice as many as last year. Yeah, that's true in many European countries, and that's simply because they've gone back to normal when it comes to travel behavior and generally summer type activities. So we've now got a fatality that is natural, whereas last two summers we did not. Right? And that explains to some degree this increase during the summer months here, which is somewhat counter-cyclical, if you like, on the assumption that the virus is a seasonal animal. But I also, and that you find that in all the European countries to some degree, and also in the US. So that's quite consistent. That's sort of summer activity. But remember, I also argued last time that possibly there could be change to the seasonality, not an entire abandonment of its seasonality, but maybe the virus maybe have become less seasonal, less strongly seasonal than it was initially. And that could be part of its response to vaccinations and generally to its being treated differently than all its competitors, right? Which puts additional evolutionary pressure on it, remember, and forces it to mutate faster. And part of that mutational activity and that changes in variants may be that newer variants have become somewhat less seasonal because it allows them to have more space to compete in low season when many of the other viruses lie low. Right? So if it could be counter-seasonal, it could be a big competitive advantage to this virus. I don't think it will be completely counter-seasonal, but it will be somewhat less seasonal than in the first 2 years. That is a hypothesis, and it's too early to really test that fully, but we will see how, this autumn and this winter play out, and then maybe early next year, I will be able to say more about this. I promised I wanted to add look at New Zealand, which is this sort of zero COVID island, which then a few months ago then started opening up and predictably had a fair amount of fatalities since opening up, but still, if you compared with some comparable countries, so these are Western countries, similar level of education, similar level of wealth, largely similar populations. Sweden and Switzerland are about twice as big. The others are all in the range around 5 million inhabitants or so. So quite somewhat comparable. Now the difference is, of course, New Zealand is really a remote island, or a bunch of islands, whereas all these other countries are not. Norway is the most similar in that it is quite isolated. Its population centers are quite isolated from neighboring countries. I mean, quite big distances. Of course, you can fly, of course, physically quite somewhat isolated, right? Ireland less so, even though it's an island, because of North Ireland being part of Britain, so it's really quite connected. Switzerland is probably the most embedded of all these countries here on the list. It's got neighboring countries all around, and there's so much movement across the border that they tried initially to close borders, but they couldn't last very long. It was impossible. So there have been open border, for much of the period. So has been Sweden, right? Which had just the sort of the political choice of remaining open. Finland, Denmark, Norway all had to some degree, and Ireland all to some degree had restrictions at some point or another, but none of them as substantial as New Zealand. So where that takes us now is that New Zealand does have the lowest per capita fatality, as you would expect. The question is, will that remain the case, or will New Zealand just simply catch up with the others? Right? My guess is it will continue to catch up somewhat, but not entirely. So there is a certain net gain in extended lives from 2 years of zero COVID policy. I think that's what we will find. But that number, of course, these people are on average 80 years old, and you've extended their lives by maybe just a few years, right? So we have to really put that in perspective with, the 2 years of basically terror against the entire population. But whether it's worth it or not is in the end a judgment call that comes down to those two opposing parties that I talked about earlier that cannot easily be reconciled. I mean, if you're an absolutist about extending life every single day counts and is more important than any other consideration, then you will celebrate the New Zealand model. If you're an advocate of individual rights, then you will slam the New Zealand model. It's almost as bad as China. One thing I haven't done, I haven't normalized these countries for different demographics. The demographics are not hugely different. I showed here the median age in all those countries, and they're all around about 40, some a bit higher, some a bit lower. But it is noteworthy that Ireland and New Zealand are, at only 38, so they are quite substantially younger on average than the other countries. And that, of course, has a huge impact on fatality. So to really make the comparison, I would have to normalize for age, as well as the other factors I'm using, which is obesity, diabetics, and quality of the health system. In terms of quality of the health system, they're all similar, so that probably won't make any difference. But the difference in age especially, and I would have to look at those other things, and obesity and diabetics, there may or may not be hugely different between them, and their weight in my model isn't that big, right? The biggest by far is the age, right? But a difference between, let's say, 38 in New Zealand and 43 in Finland or in Switzerland, that is a huge margin, actually. So they're not that similar, actually, in terms of demographics, as I had thought they would be. I thought they would be closer together in terms of median age. So I didn't do it this time, but if I want to look at this again, eventually, maybe after the winter period, I may have to actually do that extra work and normalize for that, just to really show a fair comparison. Because on the basis of this, New Zealand's number is partially low because of the demographics and not because of the policies. And so that I need to eventually probably normalize for to have a meaningful finding. Okay, herd immunity, not much changed. Yeah, picture not much changed. No big changes anywhere here. Yeah, and I think we leave it at that. With that, take care.